Welcome to Heart Challenges Hate, a discussion series, sponsored by the College of Arts and Sciences, the Department of Catholic Studies, and the Center for Catholic Studies. Tonight's discussion, Anti-Asian Hate, an American Tradition. Join us now live from the campus of Sacred Heart University with your host, Dr. Dan Rober.
Good evening, and welcome to Heart Challenges Hate. I am your moderator this evening, and tonight we will discuss anti-Asian hate. The Heart Challenges Hate series was developed to respond to the prevalence of hatred, bigotry, and violence we see in America today, with reasoned and informed discussion of faith and values. I am pleased to introduce our panelists this evening. Na-Rae Kim is Interim Director of the Institute for Asian and Asian American Studies at the University of Connecticut. Welcome, Na-Rae. A. Rima Dial is General Manager of WSHU Public Radio. Welcome, Rima. Brent Little and David Lusink is Assistant Professor in the Department of History at Sacred Heart University with expertise in Asian studies. So let's start out our discussion with our first question. And this is kind of a broad question. What are the root causes and what is the history of Asian American and Pacific Islander exclusion and xenophobia in the United States?
Intersects, of course, with the racism, particularly of Black Americans, the history of slavery, the trauma of legal segregation, and Asian American exclusion and xenophobia intersects with that in the sense that people that were AAPI were coded as non-white and therefore were often have the same kind of legal restrictions as Black Americans or Native populations. But it also could be unique because of the unique history. The AAPI population was a history of immigrants. And so it's one way intersects with other forms of racism, particularly on the issue of white privilege, but we also can't deny the uniqueness and unique forms of discrimination and racism that the AAPI population has suffered.
I absolutely agree with Brent, and I want to add one more thing to the conversation, which is that from the very beginning of the history of Asian immigration to the United States, Asians have always been seen as un-American. So when we actually look at various immigration laws that America has put forward, it always had to control it had the goal of controlling Asian bodies from entering into America, then from barring them to citizenship rights and naturalization rights and other many rights. So there has been continual cases like Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, then Page Act of 1875, and the Johnson-Reed Act of 1924 that continually designates Asians as unfit to be American, not only as a citizen, but just unfit to come in as an immigrant, whether short-term or long-term, that continue to linger on. So that in American history, Asians were continually put into position in which they had to prove that they are American too, that they are good enough to be American, they can assimilate into America, and later on, recently, that they do not have to prove anything because they are American.
And also adding into the conversation, the military aggression against different Asian countries throughout history and the colonizations of different Asian countries as well from the West, not just American, but from the British and the French and the Spanish, has always placed many Asian cultures and Asian people as the other. Whether it's been, for example, the Spanish-American War, the Korean Vietnam War, and of recent, just the difficulties between China and the US, Asians have continually been seen as the other. So it has further complicated immigration into the United States for Asian Americans throughout history.
So, there we go. So just sort of adding on to what other people have said, in particular with the history of the Exclusion Acts, that especially the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and others, a lot of that was actually coming out of anti-Chinese and sometimes anti-Asian violence that was happening. So, for example, in like 1877 in San Francisco, there were riots that white Americans were setting things on fire, including a whole wharf in San Francisco, trying to drive Chinese out of the city. 3 years later in Denver in 1880, there were race riots with one Chinese person dead. In 1886, there were riots in Seattle trying to get rid of all Chinese from the city. And, where you might sort of ask, where does this come from? Where was this violence rooted? And I think absolutely, as Brent said, it was rooted in white privilege and white supremacy. The fact that the Chinese in this particular case, in these cases that I've mentioned, didn't have any rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't become citizens. So they become an easy target. People who have no protection. And maybe I'll leave it at that for now.
Mm-hmm. Well, connecting together in some ways what Rima and David have both said, I'd like to think about some of the internal diversity within the communities of people who identify as AAPI. How has racism manifested itself differently in reaction to these different communities? How have different communities of Asian American and Pacific Islanders experienced racism, perhaps in similar ways or perhaps in very distinct ways in American history, and particularly recently?
Well, I think one of the most shameful examples of discrimination against API population, particularly with the Japanese concentration camps in World War II, when they were forcibly, because their loyalty to the U.S. was questioned, forced into concentration camps hundreds of miles from where they were living on the West Coast. And that's a very prominent historical example of government.
Should I switch this mic around, or?
But you also see
I don't know. How are they? They're not here. Yeah.
Targets against specific groups by individuals, and there's we all know about the tragic shooting at the FedEx facility out in Indiana recently, and many of those members were Sikh, but a much more prominent example, or maybe an earlier example of violence against the Sikh community, if you don't know, the Sikh is a religion that originated in India, for those of you who don't know, was in 2012 in Wisconsin, when a person who confused Sikhs for Muslims, and he was anti-Muslim, another form of tragic violence, mistakenly targeted a Sikh temple. So the forms of racism can be very varied and really can depend on recent events and in terms of their exact concrete manifestation at a particular time period in American history.
On the flip side, though, one of the things that I'd also like to add is that many times, many of us who belong to AAPI communities get confused for each other. For example, the situation that we had with the murder and the trial of those who killed Vincent Chin, who was mistaken for being Japanese American, and his murderers were auto workers who were upset with the situation where they thought Japanese Americans were taking over their jobs. The times that I've had racial slurs been targeted at me personally, no one's figured out in that moment that I'm being targeted that I'm Filipino American. So I've been called different slurs that are wrongly attached to the wrong racial and ethnic group than my own. And so I think that's what's truly disturbing with the situation that we've had over the past year and a half, where the former president used the word China virus and Kung flu and just targeted Asian Americans in general. And then you've had the rise of horrible games such as Slap an Asian, which was prevalent in the Bay Area and San Francisco. And so regardless of the historical and current types of vitriol that has been thrown our way, all of us within the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities have really been under threat, and the escalation of that has just been rather horrific.
Yeah, I want to add to that by pointing out how the category of Asian American was a self-appointed one in reaction to many other racial epithets like the Orientals, gooks, what have you. Because Asian Americans were sick and tired of being seen as these outsiders who are not Americans but Asians. As Rima pointed out, Asian Americans decided to grouped together using this self-appointed political category, despite the discrepancies and differences in ethnic groups and different cultures within, because of the shared experience of racial discrimination in the United States. So in that sense, I absolutely agree with Rima that there is that shared idea that Asian Americans have been continually otherized in America, and in a very particular way that lumps them together. But also, as Brent points out, there has been historically so many different ways in which that different Asian groups have been racialized in the United States. For instance, people forget that there is this wealth discrepancy within Asian Americans, that some people have settled in the United States for over 100 years, like Chinese and Filipinos and Koreans, whereas people like Burmese and Koreans, more recent refugee groups, they're still struggling. They're not, quote unquote, the model minorities who have settled in America yet. They still need different social support and recognition that people fail to provide because they think, oh, Asians are better off. They have made it in the United States. So people fail to recognize that within the Asian Americans groups, there are just so many wealth discrepancy, different accesses to social resources, different levels of linguistic and cultural assimilatedness that helps them to fare in this country better.
I think that clearly, I don't think anyone has used this word yet, but clearly there's a lot of ignorance behind a lot of the anti-Asian hate, anti-Asian violence that's been happening since the 19th century and right up until right now. And this ignorance has led to, as others have said, this clear sort of lack of distinguishing. So first of all, there's ignorance about who is who and who has done what, and so for example, right now, to say to leap in this enormous leap of logic from, okay, maybe the Chinese government bears some responsibility for something, but the Chinese government over there, what does that have to do with certainly Chinese Americans or even Chinese citizens over here. It just takes this enormous leap of logic, and yet somehow there's a short circuit, and there's no need to have any logical connection between these things. And so it's just straight to these racial epithets, straight to these to the violence in these horrible cases that we've seen even in New York City and San Francisco in recent weeks and months.
Yeah, I want to briefly add how Asian Americans and Asians, which are also lumped together very frequently in America, have often been blamed for internal problems in America. So I think it's not a coincidence that the COVID-19 was blamed again on China, which then was again lumped onto various groups of Asian Americans in the United States. Wherever there has been internal disputes or economic difficulties or trade difficulties, America has continually blamed Asians for it. Just as Rima pointed out, the Vincent Chin case earlier, the question of auto industry and the lack of national transition to meet the economic shortages and labor shortages and need was then blamed onto Asian laborers or Japanese auto industry, rather than to see problems internally. So this very language of war that the previous President Trump used against China, then again to Asian Americans, has just been ongoing. And that has to do with the particular racialization of Asian Americans as pathogens, these intruders into America, both in the literal and moral sense.
Yeah, I think that this has been a very interesting discussion. And I think one of the things that I really thought of during both David's comment and Nare's comment is some of how, the way some of these hatreds play out in terms of the kind of past American attitudes, right? That foreign conflicts and wars and such things, right, have been quote unquote, kind of justified reasons that there has been kind of backlash within the United States, and we've seen this not only against Asians. The Wilson administration infamously during World War I, made German Americans a target for this. This was a major source of German American kind of assimilation in this period. I remember living in Chicago and hearing about how much kind of ethnic identity among German Americans decreased during the period around World War I. We've seen this more recently after 9/11 with Arab Americans. I personally knew Arab Americans who changed the spelling of their names in order to sound less Arab in this period. And this, of course, ironically intersected with anti-Asian hate, what we're talking about, right? I remember distinctly stories of Sikhs, in particular, being victimized mistakenly. But of course, this would not have been justifiable or okay, even if they had not been Sikhs. So it kind of brings to mind that there is this history of seeing certain groups of people as other, and thus seeing it as kind of open season in a really terrible way. I'd like to shift gears, though, from this point into another important aspect of discrimination and hatred against Asian Americans, which is the so-called model minority myth. So again, there are many stereotypes with which AIPI people are burdened, but the model minority myth is one of the really kind of biggest stereotypes in contemporary society. So I'd like us to discuss this myth. What is it? How is it harmful? And how does it exist within and internally and externally to the AAPI community itself?
So Dan, before I think we jump into the whole model minority myth, I just wanted to step back a little bit and frame for us that the whole model minority name and framework that has been foisted upon the AAPI community came from a white supremacist system. And I want to frame it that way specifically because it's one of the ways that the whole model minority myth has been weaponized is it keeps the historically marginalized racial groups and ethnic groups in our country at odds with each other, right? And so I also just wanted to take a moment to frame for us that it's not always an us versus them approach. That the AAPI community has had wonderful allies from the Black community. I mean, even as far back as 1848, Frederick Douglass came forward and spoke out against the Chinese Exclusion Act. There have been wonderful allies throughout history and throughout the civil rights movement between the Asian and Black communities. Filipinos and Japanese Americans were right there with Cesar Chavez in launching the farm workers movement, both in California and in Hawaii. So I just wanted to, put a positive framework that we're not all at war with each other, and it's not just an us versus them. It's that the struggle of the AAPI community, especially when we talk about the model minority myth, is part of how we've been systematically been kept apart from each other without allowing us to build better bridges within our different communities.
So, so then let's talk about the model minority myth. Then, how does it play out in today's society?
So adding and building off of what Rima has said, the model minority myth is the stereotype toward Asian and Asian American community in the US. And it is distinctively different from earlier forms of stereotypes against Asian Americans, because earlier stereotypes, like for instance, like the yellow peril or the coolie, have been otherizing the Asian Americans, but the model minority stereotype seemingly accepts Asian Americans as the successful minority, that they have higher socioeconomic status, that they are better at education, that they have well-paying jobs. So the seeming idea that Asian Americans have made it in the United States. But as Rima points out, I want to point out two particular essays that are seen as the starting point of the model minority myth, both written by white journalists. One is Success Story Japanese American Style, and another one is Success Story of One Minority Group, and both were published in 1966, which is around the time that Asian Americans have come to be largely populated in the United States as the result of multiple immigration law reforms, which allowed Asian Americans to be Asians to be naturalized American citizens, and also due to many other liberal movements that has been happening in the United States. But these two particular articles say that Asian Americans are successful in this way and that, because of their cultural trait. So there is this nebulous idea of culture, which is pointed out as the reason for success of Asians in America. And it specifically says that unlike Asian Americans, or in case of the Success Story Japanese American Style article written by William Peterson in 1966, it specifically says that Japanese Americans could overcome their adversity, including the internment or incarceration that Brent mentioned earlier, just because they were working hard, they put their head down, they weren't complaining, they worked hard. It's in their culture, quote unquote genes was what even actually was worded in the article. And then it specifically says, unlike African Americans who are lazy, who are prone to crime, who are welfare leeches, and all these other other things that I would not necessarily want to spell out, these various forms of racializing African Americans by pitting them against Japanese American happened in that very article. And that was the very sentiment that lingered on to the very stereotype of the model minority myth, that Asian Americans are successful. But what does that mean? They're not just successful, but they are successful in comparison to other minorities who were not diligent enough, who are not quiet enough, who are not stereotype that actually is dangerous for all. It divides racial minorities against each other, unlike what Rima also has been saying, that there has been, unlike the historical examples of racial solidarity between Asian Americans and other racial minorities. And it also hides the structural problems. It buttresses the validity of the American dream while hiding the problems of the racial hierarchy, white supremacy that others have been voicing, and then just says that if you work hard, if you comply to the system, that you will be successful, as if there is nothing wrong with the structural problems in the US, but it is upon individuals, whether minorities or individual groups of people, to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. So what it actually does is to continue the status quo without finding ways to address problems in the system.
So not fascinating. There's a lot I don't know about this history of the model minority myth, and I had a question that I was hoping you could answer. I'm wondering. I'm actually Canadian, and I know a little bit more about the immigration laws in Canada, which really shifted towards the end of the 20th century towards this whole points-based system, and they would. So you would end up getting many people with PhDs and master's degrees and professional degrees from Hong Kong, Taiwan, from all sorts of Asian countries, because the whole immigration system was set up to sort of funnel those people into the country and to essentially exclude people of lower economic status. So I'm wondering if there's something in the American history, whether in those two essays from 1966 or in other discussions about model minorities, that sort of speak to actual like immigration policies that helped support this myth.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. American immigration laws have always had clause that excluded Asians till 1965 Hart-Keller Immigration Act, which actually was the first immigration act to abolish the nation-based quota. But there has always been this preference for skilled workers. So even in 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, there was an exempt class. So the merchant class who can bring in money, or the students or diplomats, people who have quote unquote potential to bring in value to America, unlike the laborers who were actually the people who were necessary for America to build its country and infrastructure. So these people who were in the exempt class were the people who had higher skills. And that has continued. So American immigration policy, even the ones that were overtly discriminating Asians, always had family reunification policy. So there was some clause that if you are married to American or if you have an American family, that you can migrate. And another policy, which was the skilled worker preference. So in Hart-Keller Immigration Act of 1965 and the ones that came earlier always had these ideas that if you are a higher skilled worker, if you can provide skills that America cannot find domestically, we will try to find ways to bring you in. So some people say that while many people praise the Hart-Keller Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 as the landmark act that that undid the racism that was built into American Immigration Act. Some people criticize it by saying that what it actually did was to change race and exchange that into preference, because Hart-Keller Act definitely says 7 different preference classes, which often had to do with the levels of education or jobs that were preferred candidates for immigration into the United States.
So I just wanted to share a quick personal story of so what does it look like, to a high school kid who can't live up to the model minority myth. I attended boarding school here in Connecticut, and I was told that my grades and my test scores and the subjects that I studied by my college counselor did not fit my ethnicity. So I excelled in the arts. I specifically excelled in theater and English and wanted to pursue a degree in anthropology for college, but I was told I would not get into the colleges of my choice because my academic pursuits did not fit my ethnicity. So that's what the model minority myth does in terms of harm on an everyday level. On another everyday level, it also means that many Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not counted as persons of color in government survey data. So we don't know enough, for example, about incidences of cancer, poverty, diabetes, or need for educational and special services for our own communities, because we're literally just not counted and not seen as needing assistance and safety nets in our own communities because of the model minority myth. And clearly that is incredibly harmful for any community, regardless of race or ethnic origin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this has been a very interesting discussion, especially I think in terms of the ways that the model minority myth has been weaponized against other minority groups, which Nare talked about very effectively. And you see this all the time in discussions about affirmative action and such things, right, where the model minority myth about Asians is weaponized against especially Black Americans. What I'd like to do right now is shift gears a little bit to sort of the occasion for our discussion in a lot of ways, which is the recent incidences of hate, especially violent hate, against Asian Americans. And so I want to think about this. What factors have fueled the increased pattern of AAPI hate, particularly the horrible incident we saw in Atlanta a little over a month ago now, and the violence in our country against AAPI persons more recently? What has been going on there?
Brought up the unfortunate scapegoating of Asian Americans with the COVID situation, particularly with the rhetoric of the last president and many of his followers. The situation, the tragic situation in the Atlanta area involving several Korean women being murdered. I'm sure that has some connection to do with the rhetoric of the last year, the blame of COVID. But I'd also like to just point out the intersection between racism against Asian Americans, AAPI, and also this long history of fetishization, particularly of Asian American women. This is deep in Western society. As early as the 19th century, you can see play stories. The most famous one is the early 20th century opera Madame Butterfly, that became a musical about 30 years ago called Miss Saigon. You can find this in Hollywood movies, early James Bond movies. This sort of fetishization of Asian American women as docile, obedient, hypersexualized. And so, at least in white European culture, and I know that sometimes the rhetoric surrounding the murderer in Atlanta was, oh, he had a sexual addiction. And that's probably true. But that also, sexual addiction intersects with racism. I don't think it was a coincidence that he was targeting places that not only had he been to, so he chose those places well ahead of time of his crime to become affiliated with, but he chose to target women that were Korean American. So I really don't like this rhetoric with the murder that, oh, it was just one guy's sexual addiction. I think you have to see it in a larger context of Western society around this fetishization of Asian American women.
It's probably also important that, since you bring that up, Brent, that the very first Exclusion Act of Asian, well, it wasn't specifically targeted at Asians, but in 1875, the Page Act was specifically directed towards Oriental sex workers, and that then developed 7 years later into the full Chinese Exclusion Act that lasted for almost 100 years. So right from the very root, there's been this connection between Asian women, sex work, and structural, even government-led racism in America.
Yeah,
And
since others.
sorry, go ahead, Nare.
Rita. Go ahead first,
No, go
because
ahead.
I'm gonna jump onto another
Okay.
topic.
No, David and Brent, thank you for starting the conversation. I mean, it is absolutely important to discuss the intersectionality between gun violence, mental health, the violence against women, and then the racism on top of it, not to mention then the rhetoric that the police department and the chief of police that arrested the gunman said that he was just having a bad day and tried. And I really see that also as the patriarchal white supremacist system that attempts to humanize a perpetrator by having a bad day. Well, what about the 8 lives that gunman took? And so clearly, what I also just wanted to pause a moment in this conversation and to recognize that this evening on April 20th, right before we've come on for this panel, we just heard the verdict of the Chauvin trial, and that he was convicted on all counts. And I think it is important to look at the intersectionality of the crimes of this nature that we have witnessed, and how that's tied in to a systemic system that we all must work hard to dismantle. Go ahead now, Ray.
Thank you. Yeah, I absolutely agree with all the panelists. I just wanted to point out how, because others have so eloquently pointed out what was going on in the crime scene, I wanted to point out how it was covered in media, and I want to touch on the effect of media. The names of the victims have continually and repeatedly been misspelled. Wrong photos went up when the journalist was talking about a different person. Names were mistaken, pronounced wrong, and many times they were just not acknowledged. Also, what went on was how the media continued to cover the incident as focusing on the massage parlors or possible places in which there were illicit sexual activities. So what I'm getting at is, just as others have pointed out, the intersectionality of race and sexism that was going on, that continues to happen in the way in which that we think about the issue, and media perpetuates those ideas that these women perhaps had it coming because they were working in these jobs, or their names are not important to remember or to acknowledge correctly because they are foreign. Again, having to deal with this idea that being Asian is not fully American enough, therefore ignorance is pardoned. Those difficulties are not something that you have to overcome, unlike Anglicized Euro-American names that, even though has more syllables, are of course something that you would remember to pronounce correctly. So these kind of continued way in which Asian racialization and sexualization go together is the root cause of what happened in Atlanta shooting, is what continues to happen in the way in which the media portrays the issue, is the way in which that we are continued to led to think about it when you do not see the whole context. So I really appreciate how all of the panelists have pointed out to the larger context, that this is not an isolated incident. This is not about an individual gunman. This is not something that just happened only as the response to the pandemic or only as the response to the previous president's rhetoric, but it has the longer historical roots that we need to address, that this was a latent issue that is coming out right now. And also the fact that Asian American community has been voicing out the rise of anti-Asian violence from the beginning of the pandemic, if not before, and it only took the murder of 8 people for the nation to pay attention.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up Nare's very good points there with something that kind of connects a few of these points together, which is this question about kind of the media and attention spans. And I think it's helpful, especially that Rima brought up the Chauvin trial and the events surrounding the killing of George Floyd, which have been enormously important for American society in terms of the conversation about anti-Black racism that those have opened up. But do we think that there has been a tendency for media to downplay or just kind of miss the narrative on anti-Asian hate because there's been so much else going on? Again, not to set up kind of competing narratives, but because, since the shooting in Atlanta, there have been a number of high-profile mass shootings. Among them, another one which, as Brent, I believe, pointed out, right, also had some overtones of anti-Asian violence, at least in terms of some of the victims. But there have been quite a number of mass shootings around the country since the Atlanta shooting. In the midst of the anti-Asian hate wave that's been going on since the COVID crisis began, right, there have been a lot of other things going on in terms of violence in the country, right, both the killing of George Floyd and a number of other Black Americans by police that have inspired outrage, as well as the insurrection that we saw at the Capitol on January 6th. So is there a danger of anti-Asian hate getting lost in the shuffle or kind of drowned out by everything else going on? Do we see that as going on?
So I think that's an important question, Dan, but I think I would like to frame this for us as it's not a competition. We don't have to say that we deserve martyrdom any more or any less than the other historically marginalized communities. I mean, what we can say is that the Stop AAPI hate report that came out this past March, over the past year, we've seen an increase of AAPI hate crimes rise by 150% across the country. That's just in the span of 1 year. The New York Police Department, New York City Police Department has reported an increase of 1,000% of AAPI hate crimes just in New York City alone. In Connecticut, Attorney General William Tong has also been speaking out about the increase that we've seen here in our home state. So I bring all of this up to also say the hate crime experienced by the AAPI community isn't just murders. The majority of the hate crimes that the AAPI community has seen on the rise has actually been 2/3 targeted towards women, and they have been verbal assaults or physical assaults that happen in broad daylight. So that's the increase of just the rhetoric. So yes, while historically hate crimes against our communities have existed since we have arrived in this country, this past year has definitely seen a rise because of the anti-Asian rhetoric that came from the past presidency.
Ended on that point, I might just say, someone might ask, what does this one person have to do with all this other stuff? And if it's your crazy uncle who says something, okay, that's not great, but it's just this guy that you see once a year, and he says these racist things. But if that person has the platform of the presidency and is able to say things that are heard around the world in a way that gives permission and it takes a lid off of that crazy uncle and all these other people to do and say things, and even I think in an illogical way to sort of direct their own, whatever is going on, to direct that into these kinds of acts of hatred. The other thing maybe that what you said brought up for me, which I only came to realize in the last couple of weeks. I'm a Canadian. We have a much higher percentage of Asian Canadians, people of recent or long, many generations in Canada. And I knew that there were some race issues, but I did not realize that in the last year, the per capita rate of anti-Asian hate incidences in Canada is higher than in the U.S. And that's not to, compete in some kind of a way, but it certainly says something that even in Canada, which has for a long time prided itself on multiculturalism and celebrating foreign many cultures within the country, this stuff is still sort of sitting there, kind of latent, and can be released through these various events.
Yeah, I want to go back to Rima's point about it's not a competition, and I think that's such an important thing to keep in mind, because the intersection of all this has to do with white privilege. I mean, that's what it all comes down to, right? It's holding on to this myth that America is, a majority white country only, that, whenever there's a problem, we can other some group, whether it's, Mexican Americans or Japanese Americans or Chinese Americans or Muslim Americans or whatever. And it really does all come back to white privilege and this ingrained tradition to cling to power, whether through the legal system or and other means. And it's tragic. I mean, Nare and Rima brought up these incidences and these hate crimes in San Francisco and New York. And you're thinking, my gosh, these are some of the most diverse American cities that we have. And even there, people are not fully welcomed So it really is going to be a very long, I think, long struggle before we can really divest ourselves of this this white racism.
And I know we may be running short on time, but there was a question I really hoped we could address, which is if students are watching, I did ask some of my students to watch, and maybe there's others watching, what can we do about this? And I'm going to answer first because I'm probably not going to speak anymore. And I just want to say, be curious about people of Asian descent, people who are different than you, who look different, ask questions, get to know people, make friends with people who are not like you. And I did that when I was your age, and it led me to become a historian of China. And I lived in Asia for over 6 years, and it completely transformed my life, and it was great.
I'll just say a few things and just I'll shut up too then. I just want to actually I have the exact same thing really to say, maybe just in a slightly different way as David, which is to just get to know the incredible diversity, and it's a state of our ignorance, like Rima was saying, when people don't even recognize the difference between a Filipino American versus a Korean American in terms of their own cultural background. That does not justify hatred, violence towards any one group, of course, but it's just a sign of American ignorance, that we get so confused over what should be pretty basic things. So to just respect the incredible diversity, learn that diversity, and just also know that when you know a little bit about the history of Asian cultures, the various Asian cultures of various Asian countries, it's also a history to reconcile with your own country's colonialism. To bring up an example, the Philippines was under American rule. Americans like to think themselves that colonialism was only a British thing or a French thing, but it wasn't. It was also an American thing. I mean, we ruled the Philippines for several decades. So I just would encourage students to, you wouldn't confuse an Italian's history for an Irish person's history. Likewise, don't confuse an Indian person's history for, a Chinese person's history. So just respect and learn the great diversity and be humble.
One of the things that we have here at Sacred Heart University is the values of the Catholic tradition for inquiry and intellect. And from that place too, I also join my fellow panelists to look at history and to learn the history of Asian American and Pacific Islander communities here within the United States. And then also be mindful of the nuance that there is a different history for Asians who are immigrants here in our country versus Asian Americans. As Nare said, the Chinese, the Korean, and Filipino communities have been here for over 100 years. We have records, historical records, that Asian Americans fought in the Civil War. And so the founding of our country is based on a lot of the communities that have been otherized historically, beyond just the AAPI communities. But that history is also separate, distinct, and incredibly different than recent Asian immigrants who have come to this country and who also have experiences with the United States and the West through incredibly tough situations like economic sanctions that have been levied upon them in their countries of origin, the Korean War, the Vietnamese War, World War II. And that carries a different kind of history and baggage that exists. I am also really pleased that the Congress here in Connecticut is passing a law that will allow Asian American and Pacific Islander history to be taught at the middle school and high school level. And that really, education does go a long way in understanding.
I absolutely agree with all the panelists, and thank you, Rima, for bringing up HB 6619. Please continue to see it through. This bill, which mandates public high schools and middle schools in Connecticut to introduce Asian American history. But please note that this is not a mandatory nor required thing. It's an elective courses, and it's a suggestion and a recommendation, and which also actually happens alongside a bill that passed already in 2019 regarding African American history and Latino history, right? So Asian American history is a latecomer, which also speaks a little bit about the way in which Asian Americans are perceived within the state of Connecticut as well, right? So please see it through. Please demand courses at Sacred Heart, at other places, forums like this. Please know that Asian Americans and Asians were and are continually foundational to define America. Asian Americans have changed American immigration law, literally defining who Americans are and who Americans should be. And Asian Americans are continually doing that in these moments in which America is struggling with these ideas of equality, justice, inclusion. And I just wanted to also urge people to go out to your community. Sacred Heart is in the Fairfax County, Fairfield County, which happens to be the most county that has the most diverse wealth gap in the state of Connecticut. There's places like Bridgeport in which there is actually Little Asia, which is too tiny, but there are Asian American and Asian community, which some people are doing well, some people are struggling. There are Asian Americans who, like Koreans, who actually are coming in large number to the state of Connecticut. Actually, Asian Americans are the largest growing population in the state of Connecticut right now. So go out to the community, learn what is going on, pay attention to them, listen to people, not only within your Sacred Heart community, but out in the state of Connecticut, in your neighborhood, know what's going on, know what it is like, see what you can do, hear their stories, and acknowledge that they are part of Americans, that they are your neighbors.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists for what's been a really rich discussion, really multifaceted discussion of the history of both racism and discrimination against the Asian American Pacific Islander communities, but also I think just kind of some general history, some general sense of people's experience, right? And I really I think you've all made very good points, especially at the end here, about the need to get to know people, to listen to people's experiences, right? Precisely to avoid the kind of fetishization and stereotyping that have gone on so much historically directed against the AAPI community. So thanks to all of you for what's been such a wonderful discussion, and one that I know I've learned much from, and that I'm sure our students have also. And thanks to all of you watching us this evening on this Heart Challenges Hate program, and we hope it's been an enjoyable conversation for you. And so thank you very much, and have a good evening.
Thank you for joining today's conversation. To learn more, visit sacredheart.edu.